Hello, my name is David Malone.
And my name's Ian Stroud. And this is Hyperland.
On today's podcast, I'm very happy to have with us Susie Greaves. I've forgotten how long I've known Susie or how I met her, but I shall ask her that in a moment. But Susie was a member of something called Independent W.H.O. That was set up, I think, in 2007, ran from 2007 to 17. And it was basically set up by a whole bunch of concerned citizens, activists, and a whole lot of scientists who were appalled at basically a WHO cover-up of a vast amount of very good science that was done in Belarus on the effects of Chernobyl. And then she carried on being deeply committed to fighting this injustice, and she ended up translating from French into English Wladimir Chernobylov's book, The Crime of Chernobyl, the Nuclear Gulag, which is by far and away the best book on the subject. And I'm imagining most people will have seen the HBO miniseries on Chernobyl, which I personally thought was brilliant. I don't know I'll ask Susie what she makes of it. But the thing about that series is that although it brilliantly portrayed the Russian cover-up, it left you with the impression that that was what the cover-up was. It was those dastardly Soviets covering things up. And while that is true, what it left out was half of the story, which is that since then, there has been an enormous cover-up by essentially Western governments and Western science. And it's in no way something that you can dismiss as a conspiracy theory, because there is an enormous amount of extremely good science. The reason most people have never heard of it is because it's been covered up. And this cover-up has involved the silencing of Kofi Annan, who once spoke about it and was told never to speak about it again. One scientist who was imprisoned, and his health never really recovered. And two very large public scientific meetings had their entire proceedings suppressed and not published. So that's what we had to talk about. This is not a historical, gosh, let's look at something that happened many, many years ago in Russia. This is an ongoing thing. Half of the information that anyone needs in order to discuss how safe or otherwise exposure to nuclear radiation is, you can't have the discussion. So, Susie, thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
Pleased to be here.
Can you remember how we got in contact?
I really can't, but I do think that it is because I learnt that you were one of the few journalists that understood about the scientist Bandajewski that we're going to talk about later in the programme. And I think I got in contact with you and brought the book. But at that stage, I don't know whether I translated it. I don't think I can. I can't even remember the year.
I can't either, because we both got interested in the sort of what was going on after Chernobyl.
Yes.
With the very first publication. Do you remember the book? I've got it. It had a picture of a young girl that looked like a thalidomide baby on the front.
Yes.
She had no arms and no legs.
That's the Permanent People's Tribunal.
Right.
I can't remember where that was held, but yes, I've got that book as well. But that actually wasn't the first. Yes, so that's how you got into it. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, look. I mean, in essence, what we're here to talk about, I think, is the work of two scientists, Bandashevsky and Nestorenko, and what they said, and the long and sordid history of how their scientific work has been suppressed. I don't know any other words you can use for it, really.
Yes, and can I just begin, first of all, by centering on the book Wladimir wrote, just to explain the title to people who don't know anything about Chernobyl. The crime of Chernobyl that they're talking about is not the explosion, it is the cover-up by the West, and specifically by the World Health Organization, of the health effects from Chernobyl. That's the crime that Wladimir is talking about. And one of the parts of his book is called The Strategy of Ignorance, because the information that we're going to talk about in this program could be known if they wanted to know it, but they don't want to know it, because if it was understood that low-level radiation causes this harm, it would actually signal the end of the nuclear industry completely.
Wow.
Because those kind of levels, which are in fact very low, that's true, in the contaminated territories of Chernobyl, the levels of radioactivity are comparatively low, but they cause incredible harm, which is what we're going to be discussing in the work of Nesterenko and Vanderjevsky.
So, Susan, can I ask a quick question? When you say they, are you talking, is it the WHO, or is it the sort of nuclear industry itself?
It's the nuclear lobby.
Right, okay.
And the question that you've asked is very relevant in the sense that people imagine that the World Health Organization is there to look after our health. The problem is that within the hierarchy of the United Nations, the World Health Organization is subservient to other United Nations bodies, and in particular to the Security Council, obviously.
Yeah.
And the Security Council is made up of 5 permanent members, all of whom are nuclear nations. And it is also subservient to the IAEA, the International Agency for Atomic Energy. And so anything that the WHO says about Chernobyl or about Fukushima, which we learned, later on when Fukushima happened, exactly the same thing occurred, really. The WHO do not put out any information by themselves. It all comes from the IAEA. And if you read any reports that supposedly come from the WHO and you actually look at the authors, it's usually a good half or 2/3 are people who are working for the nuclear lobby, either for the IAEA or other nuclear bodies like UNSCEAR, which is the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. There are various bodies involved in the nuclear lobby. But basically, when I say they, I'm talking about the nuclear lobby.
Right.
Yeah, because the IAEA, they report directly to the Security Council, whereas the WHO don't. So,
no.
The IAEA can suppress anything that the WHO might want to say, but not the other way around.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, it's even worse than that, really, because after Fukushima, not the Director General, but her second in command, Maria Neira, was actually quoted as saying to journalists, if you want to know anything about what's happened at Fukushima, ask the IAEA.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's sort of, they're almost not ashamed of the fact that they're not independent of the nuclear lobby. They don't seem to see that that's a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
Well, look, shall we talk about Nesterenko, his work, and Bandashevsky's work, just to make it clear the difference between what the health effects they're looking at and the health effects that have generally been the basis for setting levels and deciding what is going to make people sick?
Yes. Well, I could tell you a little bit about Nesterenko, but I wonder whether, first of all, David, you and me started talking about this the other day, that basically the whole basis for radio protection is completely bogus. And in his book, Wladimir calls it the scientific artifice. And sometimes he calls it the Hiroshima dogma, which is that all our radio protection is based on the idea that it's like Hiroshima. But there are enormous differences between what happened at Hiroshima and the health effects that have resulted from Chernobyl. Because the people who died at Hiroshima, in the main, were basically incinerated. A lot of the radioactivity, because of the immense heat, actually there was a kind of chimney effect, and the radioactivity went up into the sky, and of course it will have been dispersed all over the planet, that's true. But that is not what people at Hiroshima, they died because they were incinerated.
Right.
The people who died at Chernobyl, perhaps it's best at this point to divide the victims of Chernobyl up into different categories. The first ones are the people who died in the first few days and weeks, and those people did die of acute radiation. Mm-hmm. They were people who'd actually been at Chernobyl. And they comprise, people are not absolutely sure, but somewhere between about 20 and, say, 50 people. That group of victims who died in the first few days and weeks are really the only victims that the nuclear lobby acknowledges as victims.
Right, and the reason for that, Susie, is that those that died of radiation poisoning, that's ionizing radiation. That's an extremely high level external
Yes.
radiation. In other words, radiation that comes to you as invisible rays flying through the air. And that, as you say, there were a small group of people who were right around Chernobyl for whom that's how they died, because they got very close to and were exposed to extremely high levels of ionizing radiation. But that's external, and it comes to you as high energy particles, like gamma rays or X-rays or something. Whereas the other group, it's internal, it's low level, and it's not coming to you externally, it's being ingested, so it's now internal. So one, external and high doses, and that's what the nuclear industry has based everything on, leaving out completely any possibility that anyone could be made unwell through prolonged exposure to low-level internal radiation, having ingested radioactive particles. Right? That is the basic division, isn't it?
It is, that's right. There's a sort of intermediate group as well, which is the group of liquidators. So we've said there are the few firemen, the people who were working at the plant who died of acute radiation poisoning within days or weeks. Then there's the liquidators, who number about somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000.
Wow.
And these were the people that cleaned up the site over a period of about 2 years. And those people are another group of victims, which we'll talk about at some point. And those people may have had a mixture of acute external radiation, but they probably also ingested a whole lot of radionuclides as well into their lungs. So they will have had, I presume, external and internal. So they're another group. Another group are people who weren't evacuated fast enough. So you're talking about the people from Pripyat, who, the little town that supplied most of the labour. Those people weren't evacuated quickly enough. And in fact, even people in Kiev, because a few days after Chernobyl, there was the May Day celebrations.
Yeah.
And of course, radiation levels were incredibly high. So there's a huge number of different victims. But the victims that we are talking about really are the people who live in the contaminated territories of Chernobyl. And Kofi Annan, who David was mentioning him at the beginning, he numbered them at about 7 million. There are all sorts of figures because it depends which areas that you count. Yeah. There's an area that basically covers Belarus, Russia and Ukraine, just north of the Chernobyl plant. And that is the area of the worst contamination. But there's also an area a little bit northwest of that in Russia, which is very badly contaminated. And that is because when the radioactive cloud was dispersing, it was headed at one point towards Moscow. Yeah. The Russians seeded the cloud to get the radiation to fall. So there's another area just a border into Russia, which is very badly affected as well. So when the people that we're talking about, that David was mentioning, have got this chronic internal radiation, these are the people who are living in these contaminated areas. Yeah. But you don't want to think that they are the only people, because across Europe, there are places that had very heavy radioactive fallout. For instance, Corsica, south of France. And we know that in this country, the Pennines, Scotland, Wales, it isn't that long ago that restrictions were lifted on sheep, because I think that was only about 5 or 10 years ago that restrictions were lifted there. So everywhere in Northern Europe got some fallout. But the really intense areas are these areas that I've described, just north of Chernobyl and just into the border into Russia. It's a very, very rural area with these villages that got high. They're not particularly high levels. That's the point. That's what the nuclear lobby uses to say that even though they acknowledge that all these people are very ill, or the children are ill, they will say that it's because of poverty or it's because of alcohol. Yeah. We are now coming round to the work of Nestorenko and Bandajevsky. Vasily Nestorenko was born in 1934, and he was a very sort of highly qualified, very high up scientist. He ended up being the director of the Institute of Nuclear Energy for Belarus. So he was extremely high up. But following the accident at Chernobyl, he was actually called in, because he was an expert, to fly over the reactor to try to put out the fire at Chernobyl. Yeah. And he flew over the reactor with...
And you see that scene in the HBO thing, and they actually show Nestorenko as one of them. And isn't it right, Susie, that of the 4 men in the helicopter, 3 died quite early on, and he was the only one that survived. And then, of course, he died as well.
Yes, he did. And his friend was Legasov. You'll have to forgive me if I pronounce his names wrongly, but Legasov was the person who was painted as such a hero in the HBO thing. And I'm not saying that he was or wasn't. I'm not saying that. But I think it's interesting that they didn't actually name Nesterenko, because Nesterenko is a much more tricky person to deal with than Legasov. And Legasov died by suicide 2 years to the day after the accident at Chernobyl.
Wow.
And his death, I think in the HBO, they imply that he committed suicide because of pressure from the Soviets.
Yeah.
But actually, it followed a meeting with the IAEA, it was with the IAEA, I think, where they had lowered his estimations of how many people were going to die. They had cut those by 10. In other words, they had divided his predicted number of victims by 10.
Wow.
And he committed suicide on the 26th of April, 1988. And so nobody wants to, there's different views about why he committed suicide. It is possible also that he was disgruntled because he didn't get various medals that other people got and so on. But anyway, Nesterenko, I don't think is mentioned by name.
No, but what I meant is that that figure was in some way standing in for Nesterenko. But as you say, they didn't name him because he became a real thorn in their side. Yes. Because he was a proper scientist.
He was.
And as you say, he was actually called in to figure out how to put the fire out. And am I right in thinking he was the one who suggested that they use liquid nitrogen to try and cool it?
I think there was many different things that they poured on. I can't even remember all of them, but they tried all sorts of things. But the Nesterenko was absolutely convinced that people think there was a nuclear explosion at Chernobyl. There wasn't. There were 2 thermal explosions. But Nesterenko was absolutely terrified, and he remained, all his life, he remained convinced that they did actually save a much, much worse catastrophe that would basically have destroyed Northern Europe completely. Because if the molten mass had penetrated the concrete floor and met water, there would have been a nuclear explosion, and that would have basically destroyed Northern Europe. And so Nesterenko always says that the people of Europe really owed a debt of gratitude to the liquidators who stopped that happening.
Yeah. Okay. Should we just mention Bandashevsky as well? Because I just want people to understand that these are not people whose work you can dismiss saying, well, they just read a couple of things on YouTube. These were. So tell us about Bandashevsky.
Yes, by the age of 33, he was such a brilliant scientist that he was in charge of an institute in a place called Grodno. And he was already the director of a central laboratory for scientific research. And he was then appointed to set up his own institute at a place called Gomel, which is in Belarus and is right in the middle of the contaminated territories.
Yeah.
He wanted to do that because, like Nesterenko, he had a view that what had happened at Chernobyl was absolutely terrible, and he wanted to find out what had happened to the people. So he was appointed as rector at an institute that he set up himself in Gomel, and it had 200 staff and 1,500 students at any one time. So again, he was a very, very brilliant guy. He was a pathologist. In French, for some reason, they call it an anatomopathologist. We just call it a pathologist, I think. Whereas Nesterenko was a physicist.
So you have a physicist who understands the physics, and you have a biologist who understands living creatures.
Yeah.
And this is what makes their work so utterly different from all the work that came out under Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because they were basically all physicists.
Yes.
And just looking at high-level external radiation and saying, well, if you get this exposure, then you will be ill, and anything under that, you'll be fine.
Yes.
It's like saying, well, if you get hit by a kilogram of steel, you'll die. But anything less than that, you'll be fine. And leaving out the fact that if a bullet happens to pass through your heart, even though a bullet is rather small, you'll die.
Yes,
and
yes.
It's that kind of just averaging things out.
But as Susan said, that they were talking about external radiation and not the internal radiation as well.
That as well, yeah.
Yes. And they treat the body as if it's David and me were talking about this the other day, weren't we? They treat the body as if it's either a sack of water or a sack of mud. They have no concept of the body being this system of vital organs and vital systems, all in communication with each other. They have no view like that. The view of radio protection is simply that there's a given amount of radiation on a certain number of kilograms, and it's either dangerous or it isn't. But it's obviously just a completely abstract and mathematical.
Bandaszewski, he was looking at the organs though as well, isn't he? He's looking at
That's
the heart.
what. Yeah. I mean, let's just be clear about what he actually said, Susie, so that people have that right up front, because it's a very simple thing that he does.
Yes.
He's looking at, he's a pathologist, so he's looking at anatomy. So someone dies and he does an autopsy. And,
yes.
And what he found is that here's a person who hasn't been exposed to any kind of high-level ionizing radiation. So according to the IAEA and the W.H.O. and the whole nuclear industry, whatever killed them certainly wasn't anything to do with radiation.
Yes.
But then he invents, and they used it for years, a way of looking at the amount of radioactivity in certain organs.
He did. Nestorenko had been the head of this Institute for Nuclear Energy, as I say, and he'd been working on nuclear reactors and things like that, but he completely stopped doing things like that and started to produce these incredibly useful machines, one of which was an armchair which you could sit a child in, and it had a mechanism in the back whereby you could actually measure the exact amount of radiation in that child.
Wow.
And he also produced machines that could measure minute amounts of radioactivity in food. So that was his contribution, was the physical, the physics aspect of it. Bandaszewski, I'll explain how he first became involved in all of this, because it actually involved his wife at the time, who was Galina Bandaszewski. And Galina Bandaszewski was a cardiologist. And they were sitting there one evening, and she had all the cardiograms of these children on the table. And Bandaszewski matched up the damage to the heart of these children with the amount of radioactivity they had, and realized that there was a strong correlation, that the more radioactivity the child had received or had in their body, the more damage there was to the heart muscle. And that was the start of their work.
Yeah.
I mean, today when I was reading, one of the things that struck me as so odd is that Nestorenko and Bandaszewski only met in 1994, which is 8 years after Chernobyl had happened. They'd both been working separately, both of them caring for children.
Yeah.
And because Nestorenko was conducting his own absolutely dogged measurements, he would never stop measuring both the food and measuring the soil and measuring children and so on and so forth. And Bandaszewski was kind of doing the same thing, both through autopsy, as David says, but also in lab animals.
That's right. Yeah, he tested it in all kinds of labs.
It was kind of three-pronged, really. It was clinical, and it was laboratory work, and sadly, autopsy.
Yeah.
But when they got together, obviously their work they were able to make enormous strides, because working together, they needed Nestorenko to measure each child to see how much radioactivity they had inside them. And they could also then measure what the heart was like in these children and so on. So they were doing the one thing that the nuclear lobby really couldn't afford to let them do, because the nuclear lobby was able to say Chernobyl only killed 50 people, because they were denying that the health effects that were being seen across the contaminated territories, they could deny that this was caused by radiation, as long as they didn't do these measurements. So the last thing they wanted was what Nestorenko and Bandaszewski were doing.
Yeah.
Because what they were doing was proving that it was more than correlation. What they were saying was that the health effects are caused by low-level radiation. And as I said at the beginning, that was disastrous for the nuclear industry, because those kind of levels of radiation are emitted by nuclear power stations all the time.
Wow.
So that was a real threat.
Yeah, I mean, the denial that there were any deaths was basically a case of the theory being used to deny the evidence. They say, well, we've got a theory that you have to have this level. And because people hadn't had that level, then whatever they're ill from, our theory says it can't be anything to do with radiation.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
But then Nesterenko and Bandashevsky come along and they show this really close correlation between a whole range of diseases, they call them somatic diseases of the body, and a very close correlation with the amount of exposure to ingested radionucleotides. And by that, what we mean is the radioactive cesium and radioactive strontium, which, as you were saying, Susie, they're given off by nuclear power stations all the time. Shouldn't be, but they are. To get back to our business about, treating the body as if it was just a single sac, I was just going back and reading some of it. This is data from Andashevsky and Nesterenko. They were saying that they would find a whole body load of, say, 100 becquerels per kilogram. So you say, okay, so it's 100 becquerels per kilogram, not too bad. But they then found, having done the autopsy, that there would be 2,500 becquerels per kilogram if you look just at the heart tissue.
Yes.
1,500 becquerels per kilogram if you just looked in the kidney. So in other words, your whole body, you could say, well, it's just 100 per kilogram. But what they're finding is that the body itself concentrates those radioactive nucleotides. It doesn't do it evenly, but they're concentrated in certain organs. So
yes, they accumulate in certain organs, and they have affinities. Each of the radionuclides has an affinity with a certain organ of the body, although that doesn't mean to say they just stay there. But for example, we all know that radioactive iodine goes to the thyroid, cesium to the heart, strontium to the bones. Although that is, I think, a simplification. They do accumulate in those because they have an affinity with the non-radioactive.
Susan, did they get evidence from mother to child passing on the radiation in newborns?
I'm sort of going off at a tangent there because there's a...
I'm very good at doing that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you need to know, I may not be answering this, Ian, so if I'm not, then come back to me. But obviously the fetus is far more vulnerable than any other part of, when a fetus is inside the mother, that fetus is 100 times more sensitive to the same dose of radiation as an adult male. But if I tell you that radioprotection always tests against an adult male, that in itself is so unbelievably stupid that you sort of can't believe that they really do that kind of thing. So if you're talking about mother to baby, yes, if the mother does have radioactivity, it will be passed on to the fetus, because one of the things that I remember reading, it was really quite horribly shocking, is in the book, Nesterenko says, and it's shocking to see this, but he says this, that the best way for a mother to get rid of her radioactivity is to be pregnant.
Oh, yeah.
Because unfortunately, the radioactivity drains out of her and into the fetus, which is a really, really horrible thought.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, a fetus is easily...
I wish I'd asked the question.
At the most vulnerable. I was just going to quote, because it's very relevant to this. We were both talking earlier about Kofi Annan, and I just want to quote a sentence that he wrote in 2000 before he was shut up by the nuclear lobby. He's talking about the victims of Chernobyl, and he says, the victims live in 3 countries, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation. The exact number of them may never be known, but 3 million children require physical treatment. And not until 2016, at the earliest, will we know the full number of those likely to develop serious medical conditions. The most vulnerable victims were, in fact, young children or babies unborn at the moment when the reactor exploded. Their adulthood, now fast approaching, is likely to be blighted by that moment as their childhood has been. Many will die prematurely. Are we to let them live and die, believing the world indifferent to their plight? And those are Kofi Annan's words.
It's worth just giving some of the actual data that he based that opinion on.
Yes.
And these come from Bandashevsky's work, because the Gomel Institute was concerned with children's health, so they'd been looking at children's health before the Chernobyl accident, doing large surveys. So we have a good data record. And in 1985, 80% of children in the Chernobyl area were rated as being in good health. In 2000, it had gone down to 20% in good health. And these are the same scientists using the same methods to check on children of the same population. So it's not because before the accident we weren't looking, so we didn't know, and now we're looking and we're finding. They were looking before and after. And another part of the data is between 1986 and 1995, across Belarus, there was a 40% increase in significant congenital malformations. And if you count the abortions, where abortion was given because of malformation, the increase goes up to 80%.
Yes. Yes.
Those are figures which weren't plucked out of the air by some journalist. These are figures from the largest database of scientists and clinicians who've been monitoring in that area from before Chernobyl and after. So they're solid figures. These are the figures which have been suppressed.
Yes. In the public's perception of what happens with radiation is very, they know about the thyroid cancer, they know about malformations. The bit they don't understand, and that Bandashevsky is very certain about, is that it's every part of the body, it is every organ of the body that is damaged by this low-level radiation, by eating small amounts, breathing and drinking small amounts of radioactivity, which then stay in your body and do their damage. So, people just think it's just thyroid cancer or something like that. And the nuclear lobby actually plays on that, because, say, at Fukushima, the only thing you ever hear about is thyroid cancer. You don't hear about all the other health effects that there are.
Yeah.
The business with the heart, I mean, one of the harrowing passages in the book is he's talking about an autopsy he did, and basically the heart is so badly deteriorated, he's amazed that it could still have operated as a heart.
Yes.
And it is the case now that children are dying of heart conditions which you'd expect to see in someone who led a hard life and they've got to 70 years old, but they're dropping down dead as pre-teenagers. And one of the scientific reason, you say, well, but is there a scientific reason why this is so? And the answer is that the cesium, it's in the same family as potassium. And potassium, the body can't really distinguish between cesium and potassium. And you need potassium in the working of heart muscles, in the mitochondria, essentially. And so the cesium can replace the potassium and is therefore gathered by the mitochondria. So that's why it concentrates there. So we know the mechanism. It's not even that we just have some epidemiological evidence, which we do have from Bandashevsky, but we actually understand the medical, physical biology of how it happened. And why did the W.H.O. and everybody else refuse to publish it?
Yeah. Well, that is a good opportunity, actually, for one of my favourite quotes from the book. Actually, it's not from Wladimir. It's from there was a physicist called Bella Belbéoch, French physicist, who actually worked in the nuclear industry in France in the 60s and 70s. But there's a fantastic quote from her talking about the fact that they don't want to know. And the quote is this: "It is frightening the way these experts deny to the Chernobyl disaster the sad privilege of being a new phenomenon in medical experience, and close the door on the only possible approach to understanding this new phenomenon. First, record all biological and medical information." Because even though you were just saying that we know all about it, but there's a sense in which maybe we don't know all about it, and we should be doing the research. And what we've got at Chernobyl is a sort of open-air laboratory of guinea pigs who have all experienced this very low-level radiation, which they're just taking in through their food, through their water, through the air. And it may just be one tiny hot particle that lodges in their lung or lodges in their stomach, but that will eventually cause either cancer or some other disease. But yes, I'm not sure that we do know all of it. But of course, that's exactly what Bandajevsky and Nestorenko were trying to do, was to try to find out what it actually does to the body. Although I suppose, in a way, Nestorenko's main aim was, he understood the damage that was being done, and his main aim was to reduce the radioactivity within the child's body. And you and I talked about this before I sent you the article about pectin.
Yes.
About the way he found a very, very cheap way to reduce the radioactivity in a child's body, which is with this pectin cure, which is incredibly cheap. And you could put the child on this pectin cure for about 3 weeks, and it would reduce the amount of radioactivity in the child's body. And to Nestorenko's astonishment, they couldn't get funding for this. And it seemed to be blocked at every stage. And he couldn't understand why. But he does at one point say that he thought the reason why they would block such a very efficient and very cheap method was because if they acknowledged that it reduced the amount of radioactivity in the child's body, they would also have to acknowledge how widespread and how many children had levels of radioactivity in their body that were causing them harm. In other words, they'd have to acknowledge the problem, and they didn't want to acknowledge the problem.
Yeah, it's worth saying that it's not just that this solid science, the epidemiology and the biology, the physics, all exists and has been researched. But I'll give you another quote. This is by, just to show you how the nuclear lobby and its place men and women, the scientists who are complicit, how they've gone about denying it. So this is Rumyantseva. She was the Center for Social and Judiciary Psychiatry in Moscow.
Mm-hmm.
She said this, I think you actually see it on film,
Yes.
in the 2001 meeting in Kiev, because there was a big meeting there called Health Effects of Chernobyl, a 15-year follow-up study. And she actually, I can't remember if it was Bandashevsky or Nestorenko or somebody had been talking, and then she stands up and says, and she's talking about the fate of the liquidators, because as you say, thousands of them have died. And she says this: what is happening with our liquidators also is due to serious psychological trauma, of which the radiation dose they received is certainly not the principal element. She's actually suggesting, and I've heard other people suggest this, that when people die of these bodily problems, they're psychosomatic. That it was nothing to do with the radiation dose. They're just so traumatized that they die of the trauma. That's the level of dishonesty. And although it's easy to go, oh well, she was a Moscow scientist. All the Western scientists, and there's a famous German scientist who stands up, and some Japanese scientists, they were there and they heard this bullshit and they went along with it.
Yes.
And have continued to ignore the work that was done. And I mean, there were, in just the paperwork I was sent, Susie, and you probably got more than me, I've got files with over 600 scientific papers that were submitted either to the Kiev meeting or the one before that. So it's not like it's just a couple of little reports.
Yes, no, not at all. And it is significant. Both of those conferences that you're talking about, the 1995 one in Geneva and the 2000 or 2001 in Kiev, they were official WHO conferences.
That's
and
right,
it's absolutely unheard of for the abstracts, well, all of the papers really, but the abstracts in particular, to be just lost. But that is what happened to them. Many, many scientists and doctors from the contaminated territories came and presented their papers, and obviously the people from the nuclear lobby were very, very angry and very upset by all this. And afterwards, instead of being published, which most WHO conferences are, of course they're published. I mean, they have to, because, it's the world who finances the WHO, so we're entitled to see all these papers. But anyway, they were lost to view, and it did cause an enormous enormous anger at that meeting. The film Nuclear Controversies, which is Wladimir Chertkoff's film, yes, it's absolutely amazing to see the rage of these people.
I mean, if people want to see it, it's available on YouTube. We'll put up a link called Nuclear Controversies. And at the start of that, you have just this sequence of very rough footage, which he obviously filmed in I can't remember if it's in the Goebel Institute or just a children's...
yes, the beginning shots.
It's harrowing.
Yes.
There's this little girl, I don't know how old she was, 10, 11?
She was 14, and she looks about 7, and she died a few weeks after the film was made.
Yeah, and she's just trying to talk about how ill she feels, and her to keep stopping, and her teacher says, it's okay, these people are here to help. It's just appalling.
It's absolutely heartbreaking, and one of the most heartbreaking things about that is the fact that when she's asked, she's already upset, talking about how ill she is, but it's when the interviewer asks her age, and she's 14, and she does look about 7. And
then you see all these other children around her who they know they're in the same boat, and they're not even...
Yes.
And then you hear these puppets of the nuclear industry and their various governments saying, oh no, it's just trauma.
Yeah, the accusation of radiophobia is one of the more both ridiculous, but as you say, horrible accusations. And just by the way, there's a couple of scientists, I think, from America. One of them is called Timothy Musso, and the other one is called something like Anders Muller or something like that. But they have done a lot of work at Chernobyl, but to do with the animals. And as they say, do birds and animals suffer from radiophobia? Because, if you find that they're suffering the same health effects, and they're not reproducing, for example, and there's far more birth defects, and they don't live as long, and so on and so forth. Are you accusing animals and birds of suffering from radiophobia? And likewise, babies in the womb and children, they don't suffer from radiophobia.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is that's completely absurd. I'm sorry, one more thing, and a lot of this is very upsetting, I know, but we were talking about the way radiation affects the body. Children, there's a very harrowing bit in the book, actually, where they're describing children in the hospital who have been very badly affected by Chernobyl, and they die of things like chickenpox. Because chickenpox, in a healthy child, we all had chickenpox, didn't we? It's nothing.
Yeah.
But in these children, the pustules that you get with chickenpox, they're actually, the child's body is so ill because of the radiation that they have the pox inside their body as well as outside their body. In other words, their body is already so destroyed that, yes, I mean, there are some very harrowing things. But, Vladimir, the beginning of Vladimir's book, I can't remember whether you read the first chapter, which is devoted to this woman called Anna Tchertkoff, who was a teacher, but she had invited the team in because she was a primary school teacher whose children were always ill. Almost all of the children were ill, and she wanted somebody to come in and film the children and get the children to talk to camera. Yeah. But she wasn't allowed to. As soon as it was found out that her camera team had been invited in, the head teacher was on the phone and the authorities said no. Yeah. But she did talk to them. She did talk to Wladimir and his team. And the book is dedicated to her, among other people.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, it's not a problem that's going to go away, because again, the picture you get from one-time high-dose external ionizing radiation, i.e., you're standing too close to a nuclear blast, that's the body of science which has been used, and that's the image people have in mind. It's if you happen to be unlucky and you were standing too close to the blast, well, it's a one-time event. It was unfortunate, but it's been and it's gone. Whereas what we're talking about, it's low level. And I can't remember if it's cesium-137 or strontium-90, but one of the two, I forget which one it is, its half-life is 300 years. So this is not a one-time, there's a big flash in the sky, and if you were far enough away, you'd be all right.
Yes.
It's going to be there in... just slightly less now than 300 years. Yeah. So it's going to be circulating in the animals, in the soil, in people. They defecate it back out, or they die, they're buried. So it's going to continue to be there for 300 years.
Yes, and it is just being recycled. I mean, now might be the moment to try to describe one of the chapters in Vladimir's book. It's about 100 pages, and it's just transcripts of the peasants talking about trying to care for their children and trying to feed them on any food that's clean. And again, if you don't mind me quoting, because I always quote this bit because I just think it's heartbreaking, and it also just illustrates what the problem is like for these people living. They're generally, it's quite well, we would call it a poverty-stricken area, but in some ways it was a paradise, this area of Belarus, which is called Polesi, I think. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but anyway, it was an area that probably hasn't changed for, 300 or 400 years. They eat off the land. It's an area of forests and ponds, and they eat the fish, and they drink the cow's milk, and they eat blackberries and mushrooms, and they kill game, and all of it is contaminated at very low levels. And they burn on their stoves logs that are also giving off radioactivity. I'll just quote you a father who has a son who is ill, and Wladimir or Nestorenko asks him what he feeds his child on, because obviously they're supposed to try to avoid the kind of food that has levels of radioactivity. And he says, Wladimir asks him, what about your food? And this father replies, what food? The cow goes into the wood, which is radioactive. I feed the pig. It's radioactive. I fish. Can I refuse to give him fish? It's radioactive too. I can go to the shop to buy him sausages. And where is the sausage from? It's all our meat. They accept our animals. What else is there? How else can I feed him? And there's 100 pages of this kind of transcript of Nestorenko talking to the mothers or fathers and trying to find out why their child's level, say, has gone up, or in some cases, happily has gone down. Asking them what have they fed their children on recently. They'll admit that they've fed them some berries, and that has made their levels go up again. Mm-hmm. But what you're looking at is people who aren't offered any alternative. Yeah. The child's going to starve, or they're going to eat slightly radioactively contaminated food that accumulates in their body. But the saddest thing of all is that Nestorenko knew how to reduce the level by giving these children a pectin cure for a few weeks, and also if they then went abroad. Because I think don't you, that there were several organisations that offered children to go abroad for a month. Because even if you take the child abroad for a month and they have clean food, their levels of radioactivity go down a little bit. But that's just not possible for, the 2 million children who are living in these areas. But in other words, it is a problem that could be solved. It's just that we won't. Yeah. And the worst thing about why we won't is because if we admitted the problem, we'd have to close the nuclear industry down. Yeah. That's the most diabolical aspect of it.
And just to go back to the suppression of it, which is the W.H.O. meeting, there was the one in 1995, that was the one in Geneva. 700 doctors turned up, 700 to give papers. It was on the health consequences of Chernobyl, not published. So then 96, the People's Permanent Tribunal on Chernobyl, consequences on the environment, health and human rights, that's set up, and it meets in Vienna, 1996, and of course everyone just ignores it, and it's not under the WHO, so they're just a bunch of of hippies and do-gooders who don't understand anything, despite the fact that actually Bandashevsky, Nestorenko's work was talked about, there were proper scientists there. And then there's the 2001 meeting in Kiev again, which it is immortalized in the film, and you just and your jaw drops just hearing the level of scientific dishonesty. And that's part of why I'm interested. I mean, I'm appalled at how the world has just abandoned 2 million people and their children. Around Chernobyl, and I'm appalled that the effect this whole bit of science that a low level internal has just been suppressed. So it's as if, as far as science is concerned, it doesn't exist. But it's just how much of Western science, where Western science comes into contact with power and money, how that corrupted it has become. Because suppressing science becomes a bad habit. We saw it again in COVID. It's become so utterly corrupted. It just makes me think of, the Catholic Church just before the Reformation, where there might have been good priests working in local churches, but the hierarchy was utterly corrupted. And that's where Western science is now.
When we first started, we were talking about the numbers of victims, and we were also talking about the fact that the UN and the WHO only acknowledge up to about 50 deaths. And just talking about the conference, the 2001 conference, the chief medical officer of Russia said that 10% of his liquidators had died and 30% were ill. Now, if you extrapolate that to the 600,000 to 800,000 liquidators, that's
60 to 80,000, yeah,
have died, and however many more are ill. And that was in 2000. Just think how many of them are alive today. And yet they are denying that these are victims from Chernobyl. So this is what I meant about the different groups of victims. There are the immediate victims, the 50 or so that are acknowledged. You've got the liquidators who may number, who knows now? It could be almost all of them could be dead by now. But if it's not recorded as caused by radiation, then you're never going to be able to prove that that's why. The only way you could prove it is to say that these people died younger than they should have done.
Yeah.
It's not something we can go into because it's a whole other thing and there's a whole other can of worms. But this science which says another major route for people to be harmed by radioactivity is through low-level but long-term exposure, it raises the whole question of things like the use of depleted uranium weapons.
Depleted uranium.
I mean, we can't go into it because there's a whole other complicated history.
And this might be the moment to this was written by a scientist long before Chernobyl, but it just describes the process of particles inside, right? And he says here, for the benefit of non-scientists, a speck of plutonium-239, a micron in diameter, lodged in the lung will damage the tiny sphere surrounding the speck because it is being bombarded approximately every minute by alpha-emitting radionuclides travelling at about 20,000 kilometres per second. And under continuous attack, the body is unable to repair the affected area. Later on, he says, this type of continuous, intense bombardment may be on a very small scale, but this makes no difference to the fact that it will, come what may, lead to cancer of the lung. And this is the point about it, which is why, say, we were talking earlier about why it's children that matter, because if I got a speck of plutonium in my lung, I'm 71 now, it wouldn't kill me for another 20 years. So it wouldn't be noticed. You see what I mean? But this is why Kofi Annan was talking about how the people that it really affected were the people who were in the womb at the time, and the children, obviously. Yeah. I'm not saying it didn't affect people in their 20s and 30s and 40s. Of course it did. But the younger the person, this is where the health effects are at their worst.
Yeah, and what you're raising is really important, because you're right, I'd forgotten about this. There's that whole literature in Russia, I don't know about elsewhere, but certainly I've seen the titles in Russia, which went back to the 60s, where they had been looking at the presence of radioactive particles in the soil and in the food. And they'd been doing this for decades.
Yes.
I mean, it was all sort of, the boom was brought down on it once Chernobyl happened, but in the libraries and in the scientific literature, there were a whole raft of them.
Yes.
It's not something which hadn't been known about before.
Yes, and it isn't mysterious either, because at Fukushima, there was I don't know whether you've heard of a scientist called Arne Gundersen. He's another one who was a physicist. But Arne Gundersen was working with another bloke, I think his name was Cal Tofen, I can't quite remember. And they just took the radiators out of cars and put them under an X-ray. And you could see, in each of these filters, you could see the particles.
Wow.
And so what they were saying was, this is what people in Tokyo were breathing in after Fukushima. So, there's no mystery about it.
Yeah.
after an event like Fukushima, people are going to have breathed in these particles, and those people, sooner or later, that particle will kill them. Now, if you're 70, you're not going to know that that's what it was.
Yes.
But if you're 20, it's different.
Tell us about your article, because I'm sure you sent me in the past an article that you wrote for The Guardian. I don't think they published it. But
yes, they did.
To me, did they publish it?
No. Okay. They didn't even answer.
Doesn't surprise me entirely. But one of the interesting things in it is that you made the point that there were 2 other near misses in Europe. So tell us about those, because again, I haven't heard of either of these until I left France.
Well, one of them, I was actually in France when it happened. I was living in France at the time. It was the Christmas before the millennium. So we're talking about 1999. It was about the 28th or 29th of December. And there was a massive storm. It hit the west of France at a nuclear power station near Bordeaux. That accident was so close to what happened at Fukushima because everything failed. The nuclear power station was flooded, so the cooling system went down, and they came within a few hours of a meltdown, like exactly the same as at Fukushima. So that was one accident. That was 1999. And then I think either 2005 or 2006, there was a similar one in Sweden at a place called Forsmark, where again, it's always the cooling system. That's the disaster. And there's a lot of interesting stuff to do with climate change that is very relevant to this. But that same thing happened at Forsmark in Sweden. And there they said it was within minutes of a meltdown. So people will always say this, well, when Chernobyl happened, they called it a Soviet accident, didn't they?
Yes.
Could never happen anywhere else. Then it happens in Japan, technologically advanced Japan, with an American-made nuclear power station. And it happens there. So this idea that it can't happen anywhere else is...
Well, and the fact that you raise about climate change, I mean, it's just one of the facts that a great many nuclear power stations are built very low level right next to the sea.
Yeah.
For engineering reasons. But it means as we get more violent storms, so you get bigger tidal surges.
Yes.
The number of times when a storm like that could breach the walls and flood the cooling system goes up. And we're going to end up having to build enormous walls around how many nuclear power stations.
And that's not the only danger from climate change, because the other danger is that the rivers are too warm and the sea is too warm to cool nuclear reactors. So regularly, well, I'm not saying regularly, but in the past few years, in the summer, France has had to close down a lot of its nuclear power stations because they can't cool them because the temperature in the river is too high. Yeah. So it's already happening.
It's the suppression of the science which has such long-term effects, because you have various governments saying, right, well, to deal with climate change, we need to have nuclear reactors. Now, there are a whole lot of reasons why you might argue for or against. But if people knew this, would it change the debate? Would it change the risk-benefit analysis? I think
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure it would. I mean, this thing about the discrepancy between the figures, if you ask most people how many people died at Chernobyl, they probably would say, oh, well, some people say 50 and other people say 1 million. So I'll go somewhere in the middle, which is kind of like a completely irrational response. But if they understood the mechanism by which it's probably better to talk about people dying prematurely than people dying from Chernobyl. It's better to understand it that way. If they understood that there are villages in Belarus where there are no healthy children, that all these people are ill and will die prematurely. That's probably a better way to put it, to convince people.
There's a quality
it's just
of life.
that they're going to die straight away.
Yeah.
They're going to be ill for a lot of their lives and they're going to die prematurely. But people don't know it. But so your question was, what does the public need to know? They need to understand what the effect of low-level chronic ingestion of radionuclides does to the body. They need to understand that that is not innocuous, that is how people die prematurely. They don't die suddenly and dramatically, as is shown in the HBO documentary. And those deaths are tragic too. But that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at millions of lives blighted as Kofi Annan said.
And we'll go on being blighted.
And we'll go on being blighted.
300 years, because that's how long this stuff will be circulating in natural systems.
One of the scientists in Vladimir's book, and I can't remember which one it is now, but in our movement, was saying that the two most dangerous places in Europe are Sellafield, and there's a similar one on the north coast of France, where they've got these pools that are open to the air with all this radioactive, the rods that they've taken out of the nuclear reactors, and they're just in the water there, not protected by anything. That if those exploded, which they could if they weren't looked after and they weren't cooled, then that would be worse than Chernobyl.
Yeah. Well, the problem is, but amongst many, is that once you begin to feel that at the top levels of the scientific establishment, where science rubs up against money and power, that science is no longer there to protect you from no longer there to speak truth to power, to protect you, but it's become an agent of power. That's very worrying. Once that's lodged in your mind, very corrosive, because then you look at every scientific pronouncement that has to do with something that contains that has a lot of power and money tied up with it. You begin to think, are they telling me the truth?
Can I just bring us back to where we started? We were talking about how the HBO series, it was fantastic. It was a great drama. It just wasn't true.
Well, it was partially true, wasn't it? I mean, it showed it showed the Russian cover-up, which of course, the Soviet cover-up, which of course is, you can feel righteously indignant, but safe and sound, because the Soviets have gone and our scientists wouldn't do that. And that's the problem with it.
Well, that's what I realised we haven't touched on. And it is, and it's just important to know that although there was a Soviet cover-up for about 2 years, but of course there were scientists like Nesterenko who right from the start were not covering it up. The accident happened in April of 1986, but by August, the IAEA were already telling the Russian scientists how many deaths there would be and how much illness there would be. In other words, that without any knowledge, without any figures, without any measuring, with no rationale whatsoever, what they were allowed to say, the damage they were allowed to admit to. They were also assessing the different scientists in front of them to decide which ones they would collaborate with. In other words, which ones were corruptible, I suppose, is the real answer, and which ones they were not going to talk to. So people like Nesterenko. So I think it's just very important for people in the West to understand that although it was a Russian cover-up initially, you've got to remember what was happening at this time. There was perestroika, there was a lot of openness happening. And there were lots of people in Russia who wanted to get help from the West because they did understand how dire Chernobyl had been. They also understood that they didn't have the money to deal with it. So they were looking to the West for help. But of course, the nuclear lobby came in and managed the situation to keep it under control, to only admit to a certain amount of damage that they were going to admit to. So I think it's just important for people to understand that the Russian cover-up, that was sort of understandable.
And I mean, Bandashevsky was arrested.
Absolutely. I mean, sorry, another quote. It's just that Wladimir expresses it better than anybody else does. But Bandashevsky represented a nightmare for the experts of the nuclear lobby, an unforeseen obstacle in their strategy of ignorance. Here was an anatomical pathologist restoring scientific research to its rightful place at the heart of the open-air laboratory. In other words, his training had equipped him to understand perfectly the mechanisms and implications of the effects of proximity of radionuclides on vital organs at a cellular level, an area of study that official science currently refuses to recognise or even to discuss. But that's the point about Bandashevsky's work. He was an absolutely massive threat. And so he had to be got rid of. And how they got rid of him was to accuse him of corruption, accuse him of taking bribes to get students into his institute, and so on and so forth. So they had a sort of kangaroo court, and he was imprisoned in the end for about 8 years. And when he was released, and of course there's a sort of wonderful irony, this is what the world is like. Of course, Amnesty International and the French they all pretended to love Bandrzejewski and support him while he was in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And they gave him a pass. I think it's called the Freedom Passport. It's a passport that's given to people in Europe. And when he came out of prison, the French welcomed him with open arms until they realised what his work involved. And of course, then they began to realise they couldn't possibly employ him because it was far too dangerous for their nuclear industry.
Yeah.
So now he works in Ukraine. He's still alive. Nesterenko died in 2008.
Mm.
But Nesterenko had two attacks on his life, both involving cars, because they both just represented this massive threat.
This isn't a historical investigation, because what we're talking about is just a very clear example of the corruption of Western science and things like the W.H.O. Yeah. And that's very contemporary, as you see the same kind of scientific cover-up corruption with COVID.
Yeah.
And that has been slowly unraveling. And again, you see the WHO not covering itself in glory.
I don't think I would have cottoned on to what was going on with COVID and then understood all the mechanisms of it nearly so well and nearly so quickly if I hadn't already been schooled in what industry does to hide things. The corruption of science, basically, is what you're talking about. I would not have cottoned on nearly so quickly if I hadn't gone through it already with nuclear power. It's exactly the same. There's a fantastic book by somebody called David Michaels, and it's called Doubt is Our Product. And it's about casting uncertainty. As long as you can make the science seem uncertain, cast a bit of doubt, then that means that politicians can't act. And that's how tobacco, for several decades, you couldn't get legislation on tobacco because you had scientists producing doubt.
Yeah.
And that's the mechanism that they use. That's just one mechanism, though. You can see the same pattern in so many areas that affect our lives. It is science, but it affects our lives, doesn't it?
Mm.
Well, listen, Susie, it's been a long and lovely friendship. I hope we can continue to exchange information over the years. And thank you for talking to us and being the bringing Wladimir, Chertkoff and Bandrzejewski and Nesterenko in spirit, at least. Yeah. You are their representative here.
Yes.
Thank you, Susan.
Well, thank you.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed it, please leave a review.
And if you'd like to leave a comment, which would be great, we've set up a Hyperland Substack. So go to Substack, look up Hyperland, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. And if you've got ideas that we should cover, that would be great too. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you.